I grew up playing a little game called Follow the Leader. You probably did that too when you were really little. Super simple rules. The leader's in front, all the rest of the kids are behind, and whatever the leader does, everyone else has to do it too. Well, I used to have this one friend, and his goal was to be as difficult a leader as possible. He would spin around in a bunch of circles, and we would all do that too until we were super dizzy. Then he would run up the slide, backwards like you're not supposed to do. And we would try to do that. He would jump off the top of the slide. And we would try to do that too. Basically, we all got hurt. He was very tough and somewhat crazy. But our goal was to try to mimic him exactly. And as long as you could do that, you could stay in the game. Now, leadership is very important in the real world. We need good leaders in our schools. We need good leaders in our churches. We need good leaders in our marriages. We need good leaders in our nation. And this is one of the reasons why I love the Bible, because even though it is an inspired book written over the course of 1,500 years, and the passage that we're going to read today is nearly 2,000 years old, it is absolutely applicable today, because Jesus will be calling people to follow him as a leader. We're finishing up, or coming close to finishing up, a series in the book of Mark. It's called Follow. And so far we've seen Jesus heal people. We've seen Jesus teach people. We've seen people called to follow Jesus. And last week we learned what some of the expectations were for those who were called. Today, Jesus gives a great lesson on leadership. And it's something that we all need to pay attention to, regardless of who we are. It doesn't matter if you're 5 years old or 50 years old. It doesn't matter if you're in business or in school or in ministry. Everybody can learn something about leadership. And I believe that it will benefit everyone, and it will actually bring glory to God too. See, the payoff is not just for you, because if we can all raise our leadership level together, it will strengthen this church. It will strengthen our families. It will strengthen our schools, and I believe it will strengthen our nation too. I'm going to tell you right now, it's not a complicated lesson on leadership. It's not a bunch of steps. There's just a couple of steps. It's actually not complicated, but it is difficult. It's not easy to be the kind of leader that Jesus is calling you to be. Let's take a look at the context of the passage. Now, last week, we saw that Jesus was giving sort of the expectations of what it would be to follow and believe in him. And Jesus now is roughly 3 years into his ministry, and he's actually just days away from what's known as the triumphal entry. It's the beginning of the end for Jesus. Remember, he has told his disciples very clearly exactly what's going to happen to him. He's told them that he would be suffering, that he would be tortured. He's told them that they would be, or that he would be put to death. And remember what happened. The first time he said that, Peter called him aside and tried to rebuke him. And if you remember, Jesus called him Satan. He said, "Get behind me." The second time he told them, the disciples argued about who was the most important disciple. And the third time he told them most plainly, right? It creates a situation here. He says, I'm going to be betrayed. I'm going to be spit on. I'm going to be mocked. And I'm going to be killed. And you can almost envision this situation. There's this crowd following. Jesus is alone. He takes his 12 disciples aside to tell them the details and to prepare them for what's about to happen. And it's a really like a perfect example of bad timing on the part of James and John. Because right after Jesus says, listen, I'm going to do all this and I'm going to lose my life, they come to him with a favor. They say, teacher, we want you to do us a little bit of a favor. He says, when you come into your kingdom, when you're in your glory, will you allow us to sit on your right and left? It's interesting. They want fame and recognition. They want to be recognized as number one and number two disciples. There's Jesus and then them. And Jesus says, well, you don't know what you're asking. He says, well, are you willing to go through what I'm about to go through? They don't really realize exactly what he's saying, and they say yes. And he says, you know you will. You will go through it, but it's not my role to assign that kind of privilege. Now, it's interesting because you think, after all that Jesus has been teaching them over the course of 3 years, after all that he's modeled to them about humility and about serving and about putting the needs of others first, that they would come at this late hour and want some kind of notoriety is kind of fascinating. But at the same time, aren't we all a little bit wired like that? Like, we want to serve, we want to do the right thing, but we also kind of want to be known for that. And it's funny because no matter how many things sort of change, things also stay the same. I mean, isn't that sort of almost at the heart of our culture right now, being known? I mean, we have like this whole new thing. We have influencers. Isn't social media to a certain extent about being known? I saw a funny meme on Facebook. It said, I had a sandwich 28 years ago. I just didn't have social media, so I couldn't share it then, so I'm sharing it now. There's a feeling like we want to be known. We want people to know who we are. And really, that's just sort of this ambition, and it's inside of us. This need to be recognized, maybe this need to be valued. So I'm going to cut these guys a little bit of slack for having bad timing. But here's what Jesus does with it. For us, it's an important lesson. He uses it as a teachable moment to give what I think is maybe one of the most important teachings on leadership there is. And he's going to first contrast the world's view of leadership with his view of leadership. So let's look at the world's view of leadership. Verse 42. He says, you know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. And remember, the Jews didn't feel that great about the Gentiles. They're generally suspicious of the Gentiles, and they wouldn't want to copy them in any way. And what Jesus is saying is, I want you to look and see how the Gentiles do leadership. For the Gentiles, it's about authority. For the Gentiles, it's about lording over other people. For the Gentiles, it's about having a title, having a position. For example, it's important if you were one of the leaders in that area, as one of the Roman leaders, you were a magistrate, or you were a ruler, or you were a king. And those titles gave them some kind of authority, as long as they had that title. And what Jesus is doing is he's providing a negative example of leadership. Leadership doesn't come from just having a title. It comes from something else. A title is just a word that indicates who you are. And in some cases, you have to respond because of the title. Funny story. Before I was a pastor, I worked as an IT guy in an aerospace company. And my job was to help fix people's computers, make sure they could print, run the network, things like that. And we started a brand new system there that had to do with some web stuff, and they gave that responsibility to me, and they were trying to figure out a title to give me, right? Something better than IT guy. And so they said, okay, well, they came up with this idea. We'll call you the director of B2B marketing. Okay, the thing I was doing had to do with some online marketing. I said, that sounds fine to me. I didn't really care. It didn't matter to me, right? Well, the company that I worked for was actually headquartered in England, and I got a chance to go over there to do some work. I got off the plane at Heathrow Airport, and there was a guy standing there with those little signs that said, Mr. Ayers. And I thought, wow, this is nice. They sent me a fancy car. So I got in the car, and they took me to the place. They got out, and they had a special lunch arranged for me with some of the other directors. The next day, we had a special meeting, lots of people involved, and they all wanted to know what I had to say. I quickly realized what's happening here. In the United States, the title director doesn't really mean anything. But in England, director is one of the highest titles you can have. They had no idea that my real title was IT guy. They responded to the title. Now, maybe you've seen that in the workplace too. Your boss has a title, CEO. In the church world, we call that Christmas, Easter only. I don't know if you knew that. Or COO, or CFO, or president, or executive, or whatever it is. And because your boss has that title, suddenly your boss gets to tell you what to do. The title gives them the authority. And they may use that authority over you. But the truth is, it doesn't make them a leader, does it? What makes a great leader? Well, John Maxwell, who's an expert in leadership, says leadership has less to do with position and more to do with disposition. More to do with who you are. What does that mean? Well, Jesus explains it in verse 43. He says, but it shall not be so among you, but whoever would be great among you must be your, and what's your Bible say there? Servant. Now, this is Jesus' view of leadership. He says, if you want to be great, okay, if you truly want to be that person who sits on the right or the left of me, if you want to have notoriety, if you want to be recognized, well, I'm going to tell you how to do that. You must become a servant. Perhaps the desire for greatness isn't what's evil. It may not be the ambition that's evil, but it's the path you take to get there that shows your motives. If you want to be great, he says, you've got to become a servant. And he uses this Greek word diakonos. Diakonos. It's where we get the word deacon from in our church. A diakonos is somebody who simply executes the commands of another. In the Bible, it's translated as servant. Sometimes it's translated as minister. Probably the best metaphor for us nowadays might be the term waiter or server. See, in our culture right now, you probably don't have a lot of experience with servants, I'm sure. I don't think anybody here has any servants. But you do know what it's like to be waited on at a restaurant, don't you? And you know the difference between a good server and a bad server. See, a good server gets the things you want, maybe anticipates what you need ahead of time, is friendly, right? Does whatever you need them to do. And if they're a good server, then you reward them, hopefully, with a good tip after all. He says, you need to be a diakonos or a servant. And then look at verse 44. Again, Jesus' view of leadership. And whoever would be first among you must be, what's your Bible say? Slave of all. That's a difficult word in our culture, isn't it? There's all kinds of negative connotations. The Greek word used there is doulos. Doulos. It's translated servant, sometimes translated slave, oftentimes translated bondservant. And so what I want to do is explain to you what Jesus had in mind when he says doulos, slave in this context. So don't lose your place here in the book of Mark, but I'd like you to turn over to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, please. This is way up in the front of your Bible. You've got Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy is a unique book of the Bible. It's the most quoted by Jesus in all of the scriptures. And I believe that Jesus would have this in his mind as he says, be a servant. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 12. It says, if your brother a Hebrew man or Hebrew woman is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. So you have to understand, in this time, in this culture, people did have slaves. Now, this was not slavery based on race, because you can see this is a Hebrew individual having a Hebrew slave. And there was various reasons why this would be. For example, sometimes people were sold into slavery because of debt. But the Bible actually says a slave could only serve you for 6 years. The 7th year, you have to let them go. Okay, everybody's freed after 7 years. But then look at verse 16. But if he says to you, this is the servant or the slave, I will not go out from you, because he loves you and your household, since he is well off with you, then you shall take an awl and put it through his ear into the door, and he shall be your slave forever. So you're thinking, that's strange. Is there a situation where somebody after 6 years, after they had freed, would say, well, I don't want to be freed? Well, it actually happened all the time. Because what happened is they sort of grew to love each other. And it was a good working relationship. And maybe this individual didn't have another life they could go to. Maybe they couldn't support themselves. And they were treated well. And they said, you know what? I know that you're setting me free, but I don't want to be free. I want to be your bond servant. And so they would take this awl, which is kind of like a pointy knife thing, and literally put right through their ear. And then they would put an earring there, and that would be a sign that I am the bondservant of these individuals. My whole life will be given for them. Here's the interesting thing. Remember this. It was a voluntary thing, because this person had been set free. But they said, I don't want to be free. I want to work for you. Number two, it was for life. It was a lifelong commitment. And lastly, it was out of love. Did you see that? They had grown to love your household, and the household had grown to love them, and this was a voluntary decision out of love. So Christ says, that's what I want you to be. If you want to be first, then I need you to be the slave or the bondservant of all. Voluntary, for life, and most importantly, out of love. And for how many people? Just the people you like? Just the people who agree with you? Just the people who are on the same side of the political equation as you? Everybody, he says. Be a bondservant of everybody. Leaders are not made of titles. They're not made because of position. They're made because of their service. They're made because of their humble attitude. Because they're willing to give their life in the service of others. So you see the world's view of leadership versus Jesus' view of leadership. For the world, it's all about your authority and your position and your title. For Jesus, it's all about who you serve and why you're willing to serve them. And then here's the cool thing. When you go to verse 45, Jesus is actually going to model that leadership. So not only is he going to tell you what it is, he says, I'm going to act it out for you. Look at verse 45. For even the Son of Man, speaking about himself, came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Think of it this way. If anybody has the benefit of title, if anybody has the benefit of position or authority, it has to be Jesus. If anybody could use that title, if anybody could use that authority, it would have to be Jesus. In the book of Philippians, the writer Paul says Jesus actually set that aside and became a servant to everybody, even unto death. Jesus is saying, I didn't come to be served by you, even though it would be appropriate for you to do that. I didn't come to be diakonos. I came to diakonos you. I came to wait on you. I came to execute the commands of others, to meet the needs of many. And then he says that he would give his life as a ransom for many. Now, ransom is interesting because ransom is simply the amount that needs to be paid in exchange for a life. That's why when somebody's kidnapped, it's a ransom. Ransom is the amount that's paid for a life. And it carries this idea that's sort of like paying a debt equal to the cost of somebody's life. For example, buying a slave and setting them free. Jesus not only explained what it meant to be a true leader, he lived it out literally. He said, I will tell you what a leader is, and then I'm going to show you what a leader does. And he did that. So what does it take to be a biblical leader? Like I said, it's not complicated. Can you serve? Can you serve others? Can you give yourself to others voluntarily, out of love? Do we need biblical leaders? Oh, yes, we do. We need them in our church. We talked about the Next campaign. The reason why it's called Next is because these improvements and expansions we're making here at the campus have everything to do with making sure this church stays a Bible-believing, Christ-honoring church for the next several generations. And we need leaders to lead us into those next generations. We need leaders who are willing to serve. Are you willing to be those kind of leaders? Do we need leaders in our workplaces, biblical leaders? Oh, yes, we do. The great thing about leadership is it pays off in so many different ways. Obviously, it pays off in the church, but you know it pays off at work too? If you were to dedicate yourself to serving others the way Jesus did, I guarantee you, your job will go better. You'll probably receive promotions because you'll be looking out for other people. We need leaders in our schools. For those of you that are still in school, maybe elementary school, middle school, high school, college, we need biblical leaders who are willing to serve. You know where we really, really need leaders most? In the home. See, it's one thing to say, well, I can be a leader at church. That makes a lot of sense. I can serve other people at church. And I could probably even do that at work. I get how that's going to be an advantage for me. But you know, we really need them in the home. Men, let me talk to you, those of you who are married. You need to start by serving the needs of your family. Starting with your wife, your kids if you have them. Biblical leadership means that you do for them before you do for you. That you put their needs ahead of yours, voluntarily, for life, and out of love. Women, you need to do the same for your family as well. You need to serve your husband and your children out of love for Jesus. What happens when we do that as a church? What happens when we put our own ambition aside and our own need to be recognized aside and focus on the needs of others? Well, the church gets stronger. That's for sure. Our workplaces become better suited for people. Our schools, I believe, will become stronger. And I believe our nation will become stronger when we do that. But here's the most important thing. When we serve others the way Jesus served us, we're modeling the servant leadership of Jesus, which means we look like Jesus. And we're following the leader exactly the way he did. And he was willing to lay his life down for us. So this week, let me just encourage you to just give it some thought. Let's get practical for a moment. Think of 2 or 3 ways that you can serve somebody else willingly out of love in your household. Is it something you can do for your wife? Is it something you can do for your husband? Is it something you can do for your kids? Kids, is there something you can do for your mom and dad? Is there something you can do for your siblings to serve and honor them? Let's start there. Think of something you might be able to do in the workplace or at school or in the community to serve the needs of others. Think of something you could do in the church to serve the needs of others. When we do that, I believe that God will be honored. I believe that he'll be glorified. And I believe people will be drawn to Jesus Christ because they'll see him in you. Let's close in prayer.